Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 14 minutes before the Marine General arrived in room 347 with sepsis no one could explain. Katie Morrison's first week at Seattle General in Atlanta had taught her to keep her head down. Arriving at 5:53 a.m., leaving after 9 p.m., moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors with the quiet competence of someone who'd learned invisibility the way other people learn to breathe. The antiseptic smell clung to her scrubs, to her hair, settling into her skin like a second identity. She didn't mind. The cold steel of medication carts felt safer than what she'd left behind. The rhythmic beeping of monitors, steady, predictable, honest, was better than voices giving orders she could never refuse. Her hands never trembled when she started fours. Even the hardest veins, rolled, buried deep, the kind that made newer nurses sweat, submitted to her touch. The needle went in smooth. The flashback came back crimson. She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She withdrew, secured the line, labeled it in precise blue ink. 14 gauge, 18 gauge, 22. The gauge numbers were muscle memory, the kind that lived in hands instead of heads. Her left leg ached when she pivoted away from the bedside, a limp that only showed when she thought no one was watching, and she always made sure no one was watching. In the break room, nurses complained about their shifts. In the supply closet during her break, Katie turned over a tarnished military challenge coin in her pocket. Worn edges. Dull silver catching the fluorescent light like a secret. The only physical proof of who she'd been, stamped with a call sign she'd never speak again and a date she'd been ordered to forget. Ramadi. 2008, the weight of the coin felt like someone else's life pressed against her thigh. The weight of invisibility she'd been commanded to carry. Her back ached. The scars ached worst when it rained. Dr. Caldwell, chief of emergency medicine, was the kind of man who built his reputation on control. Hierarchy. Order. The kind of man who believed that authority flowed downward like gravity, from him to the residents, from the residents to the nurses, from the nurses to everyone else who had nothing. He watched Katie from the nurses' station on Tuesday morning, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. Watched her chart with a precision that made the younger nurses nervous. Watched her hands move, steady and certain, checking blood pressures on the geriatric wing. His presence made the air pressure change, and not in a way that felt safe. "Listen up," he said, loud enough for the residents to hear, loud enough for Katie to hear it register without looking up from her documentation. 7 residents clustered around him like disciples. New hire. Morrison. He gestured at her with the kind of dismissive flick you'd use to point out trash on the floor. "She'll be gone by Friday. This one's got that quiet competence thing going. They always do at first. Then the reality of working under me hits them." He smiled. Not a real smile. The kind a wolf makes showing its teeth. "Who wants in on the pool? $20 says she quits within 7 days. The residents laughed. Easy laughter. The laughter of people with secure jobs and secure futures. Katie kept her hand steady on the keyboard. The bet was already placed. The countdown had started. She'd heard this kind of thing before, not at a hospital, but in other places, other contexts, where hierarchy was measured in who could break who fastest. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She pressed enter. The documentation saved. Wednesday came with the cafeteria. Katie had waited until 1:48 p.m., until the worst of the lunch rush had cleared, wanting only to grab a sandwich and eat standing up in some quiet corner where no one had to look at her. She'd loaded her tray with careful deliberation, turkey sandwich, apple, water, the kind of meal that wouldn't spill easily. She was holding it steady, both hands, walking toward an empty table near the window when she heard his voice. Morrison. Dr. Caldwell stood 3 feet away, blocking her path. His plate held a steak, an actual steak, in a hospital cafeteria, which told you everything about what kind of man could get what he wanted. "I've been meaning to talk to you about your charting. The residents are confused by your abbreviations." It wasn't true. Her charting was meticulous. Every note cross-referenced, every medication documented with timestamp and dosage, the kind of charting that held up in court because it had to, because back in the field, imprecision meant body bags. But she didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She waited, her tray steady. The thing about working here, he continued, stepping closer, is that everyone has to learn my way. There's a hierarchy. You're not at the top of it. He reached out, his hand moving with the casual certainty of someone who'd never been told no. His hand connected with the underside of her tray. The sandwich flew. The apple rolled. The water cup tumbled through the air and came down on the tile floor with a sound like a gunshot. The room went dead silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward them. 8.3 seconds of absolute stillness. Dr. Caldwell's smile widened. "Oops," he said. "Not an apology. A performance. Better clean that up, Morrison." Katie's jaw clenched. Once. Barely perceptible. Her hands remained steady as they moved toward the mess. She bent without hesitation, without anger, without shame. The other diners watched as she gathered the bread, the lettuce, the scattered ice cubes, stacking them back on the tray with the methodical focus of someone trained to move efficiently under pressure. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She didn't look at him. She simply continued her work, cleaning the water with a napkin, each movement precise and controlled, the kind of control that came from having done harder things in darker places. "You're doing fine," one of the older nurses whispered as Katie passed the table near the window. Her name was Susan. She worked night shift. She had 43 years at Seattle General and kind eyes. "Some of us see what you are." Katie didn't respond. Couldn't. The words might have broken something. Thursday afternoon brought the chart. Katie was updating a patient's medication list at the station when Dr. Caldwell appeared beside her, holding a file folder like a weapon. The folder landed at her feet with a cold thud. Paper scattered across the floor in a controlled explosion. 14 pages. She counted them without meaning to. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched low so only she could hear, only she would understand. The other nurses suddenly became very interested in their own documentation. Katie's jaw clenched again. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from having held a rifle while crying and being ordered to keep crying quietly. She bent down, gathered the papers, stacked them with mechanical precision. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Her eye stayed down. When she stood, she held the folder out toward him with no expression at all. He didn't take it. He just smiled and walked away. That night, after her shift ended at 9:23 p.m., Katie sat in the supply closet for 17 minutes. Nobody knew she was there. The closet was small, 3 shelves of 4 bags, boxes of syringes, bottles of antiseptic that smelled like surrender. She pulled out the tarnished challenge coin from her scrub pocket and turned it over in her palm. The weight had never changed. The call sign pressed into the silver never changed. Reaper 6. The date beneath it, 2008. That date belonged to a different woman. A woman who'd carried 11 pounds of gear and the lives of 12 Marines through Ramadi on a morning that never ended. That woman had no name now. That woman couldn't exist. The Pentagon had been very clear. Erased. Scrubbed clean. Orders to never surface. But the coin remained. Hidden. Carried. Real. Katie pressed the coin against her palm until it hurt, feeling the weight of invisibility she'd been commanded to carry. This wasn't new. This was just the shape her life took now, quiet competence, head down, the kind of nurse who arrived early and left late without complaint. The kind of nurse that no one would ever make a bet about. Because making a bet meant acknowledging you saw her. She put the coin back in her pocket and returned to the ward. Room 347 was at the end of the east corridor, the kind of room they used for patients being transferred out in the morning. Sepsis, the intake note said. Etiology unknown. The patient lay still beneath the white hospital blanket, fever-flushed, his breathing shallow and rapid. The chart identified him as Marine General, rank, name, service number all listed with military precision. 61 years old. No allergies listed. No emergency contact marked. Just a Marine, somewhere in the system, burning up from the inside with an infection that nobody understood. Katie checked his vitals at 11:14 p.m. Temperature 103.4. Blood pressure dropping, 84/52 and falling. Heart rate elevated at 128. Respiration rapid and shallow. His fever-fogged eyes didn't focus on her. No recognition. No acknowledgement of the woman checking his fall line, adjusting his monitors, noting the increase in his respiratory rate. She looked at his forearm while she worked, at the scarred skin beneath the hospital gown. The scars told stories. So did tattoos. She didn't let herself look too long. She didn't let herself wonder. She just documented his vitals in precise blue ink and moved on to the next room. What she didn't know was what had been tattooed on that forearm in a FOB in Ramadi during the summer of 2008. What she didn't know was that the Marine General lying in room 347 had her name written there, not her civilian name, but the other one, the one that belonged to the version of her that didn't exist anymore. Dr. Caldwell gathered the residents around the nurse's station during morning rounds, his voice cutting across the ER like a blade. "I'll bet anyone here $50 that our little Katie doesn't last the week." He smiled, gesturing vaguely toward where Katie stood 3 feet away, charting vitals on a patient who'd come in with acute appendicitis. The quiet ones always break first. They come in all noble and selfless, and then reality hits them. By Friday, she'll be crying in her car. Laughter rippled through the group of residents, nervous laughter, the kind that comes when a superior officer establishes the rules of the game and everyone knows better than to break them. Katie's jaw clenched once, barely perceptible, a micro-movement that only someone trained to read combat zones would notice. But her hands remained steady on the keyboard. Her breathing didn't change. She continued charting as though he'd said nothing at all, her fingers moving with the precision of someone counting medication dosages, each keystroke deliberate and calm. That was the thing about invisibility, it worked both ways. They couldn't see her. And she could see everything. By afternoon, her hand still felt steady, though something had shifted in her chest, something that felt like anticipation mixed with dread. She'd survived worse than a bet. She'd survived Ramadi in the summer of 2008, had carried Marines through mortar fire while shrapnel buried itself in her back, had held bleeding men together with field dressings and will and the kind of focus that came from knowing that one mistake meant someone's daughter wouldn't come home. A $50 bet in an ER cafeteria was nothing. Except it wasn't just a bet. It was a test. It was Caldwell establishing dominance the way alpha predators did, loud, public, leaving no room for anyone to miss the message, "You don't belong here." He saw her competence as a threat to his control, the same way he saw the nurses who questioned orders as insubordinate, the same way he saw anyone who worked quietly without complaint as someone plotting against him. In his world, silence meant rebellion. Katie carried her tray through the crowded cafeteria at 12:22 p.m., moving through the lunch crowd with a kind of focus that made people step aside without knowing why. She'd chosen a corner route, the one that avoided the doctor's table where Caldwell usually held court. But he was waiting. His hand shot out from the side just as she passed, connecting with the edge of her tray with casual, calculated precision. The tray tipped. Gravity did the rest. Food scattered across the tile floor in a wide arc, a sandwich, apple slices, a carton of yogurt that exploded like a grenade, splashing white across the tile. 50 people stopped chewing. "Oops," Caldwell said, his voice carrying a smile like broken glass. "Better clean that up before someone slips. We wouldn't want to lose you to a negligence lawsuit." He was already walking away, already laughing with the doctors at his table, already the victor in a game Katie hadn't signed up for but was now losing by the simple act of existing in his space. Katie knelt without a word. Her knees hit the tile floor and she began gathering soggy sandwich pieces, apple slices, the yogurt container, all while conversations resumed around her like nothing had happened. A surgical resident stepped over her. A nurse offered to help and Katie declined with a single shake of her head. She worked methodically, her movements controlled, her jaw set in that same barely perceptible clench. Her face showed nothing. No anger, no humiliation, no trembling hands. The mask was perfect because the mask was armor, because the version of her that had worn a uniform and carried a call sign had learned that showing emotion was the same as showing weakness, and showing weakness in a combat zone meant someone died. But late that night, alone in the supply closet at 11:23 p.m., Katie sat on an overturned bucket with her head in her hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. The challenge coin was gripped so tightly in her right palm that it left an impression, a circular indentation that ached. She turned it over and over, feeling the weight of metal that had once fallen from a Marine's neck in a place she'd been ordered to forget. The coin was tarnished now, years of being carried in pockets having worn away the shine, but the inscription was still visible if you knew where to look: 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. Summer 2008. Ramadi. She didn't hear the footsteps until they were already at the supply closet door. She shoved the coin back into her pocket and stood, composing her face in the 0.3 seconds she had. But it was just another nurse, grabbing saline bags, who didn't even glance in Katie's direction. Still, the moment was broken. The armor had held. The general in room 347 had deteriorated over the next 2 days despite broad-spectrum antibiotics, ceftriaxone, vancomycin, a combination that should have been working against whatever was ravaging his system. Katie reviewed his chart during her breaks on the evening shift, noting the inconsistencies that no one else seemed to see. His presentation didn't match standard sepsis protocols. His pre-admission medical history was redacted, entire pages blacked out in the system with that telltale censoring that only appeared for military personnel with classified backgrounds. Rows of black lines. Names removed. Dates removed. Just a ghost of a medical record, a skeleton outline of a man's history with no flesh on the bones. When she checked his vitals at 9:18 p.m. on the second night, his breathing had become labored, his respiratory rate climbing to 24 breaths per minute, his oxygen saturation dropping to 91% on room air. His blood pressure was down, 118/72, and dropping. The monitors showed a heart rate that couldn't decide whether to race or collapse, fluctuating between 94 and 118 beats per minute like someone trying to remember how to breathe. She reported it to Dr. Caldwell, who was standing near the medication dispensary reviewing a patient's chart. She approached him with that careful deference, the mask still in place, her voice pitched low and professional. "Doctor, the general's vitals are declining. Respiratory rate 24, O2 sat 91. I'm concerned about his trajectory." Caldwell barely looked up. "He's being transferred to Walter Reed in the morning. Not our problem." He turned a page. Dismissed her. Dismissed the patient. Dismissed the danger hanging in room 347 like fog rolling in from the water. But Katie saw something the others missed because she'd been trained to see it, trained in a classroom made of blood and shrapnel and the particular sound that a man makes when his lungs are filling with fluid he can't breathe through. She saw the subtle jugular vein distension, the way the veins in his neck stood out like cords against his skin. She saw the muffled heart sounds on auscultation, the kind of muffled that happened when something was compressing the heart from the outside, restricting it, choking it. She'd seen cardiac tamponade twice in Ramadi, both times in blast victims whose chests had been opened by shrapnel and whose pericardial sacs had filled with blood faster than their bodies could compensate. The difference between life and death was often just a diagnosis. At 11 p.m., she entered room 347 to find the general semi-conscious, his lips taking on that pale blue tint that meant his oxygen saturation was critical. His skin had the waxy appearance of profound shock. She took his hand to check his radial pulse and his fever-fogged eyes opened briefly, unfocused and wandering, locked somewhere between dreams and reality. "Reaper," he whispered, the word barely audible, a sound like wind through a canyon. "Reaper 6. The world stopped. Her blood went cold, not in the dramatic way people described it in books, but in the actual physiological way, blood vessels constricting, core temperature dropping a fraction of a degree, every system in her body recognizing a threat that couldn't be neutralized with training or composure. No one had called her that in 3 years. Not since the classified operation in Ramadi that had erased her from all records, not since the orders came down from people who didn't give their names, orders to disappear, to assume a civilian identity, to never surface again. That name belonged to a version of her that didn't exist anymore, a version that had been officially terminated. Her composure fractured for just a moment, not long enough for anyone to see it, but long enough for her to feel it, a hairline crack in the mask she'd been wearing all week. "It's okay," she said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly as she reached for his fall line, checking the flow rate, buying time for her mind to catch up with the impossible mathematics of this moment. "You're in the hospital. You're safe." His eyes closed again, his hand falling limp against the blanket. But the damage was done. He knew. He'd recognized her somehow, despite the 3 years and the civilian clothes and the name change and every single precaution that had been designed to make her invisible. His eyes had seen through all of it. At 1:13 a.m., the monitors screamed. 2 of them at once, the cardiac monitor and the pulse oximeter both shrieking their alarm tone, a sound like a raptor's cry amplified through the hospital speakers. Katie was first through the door, already running, her body moving on instinct faster than conscious thought could travel. His O2 sat had crashed to 67%. His blood pressure was 58/31. His heart rate was 142 and climbing, desperate, a drowning man's rhythm. The pericardial effusion had compressed the heart completely. She didn't call for backup yet. Not yet. The heart monitor screamed at 2:07 a.m. One long continuous wail that meant the general's blood pressure had cratered below the machine's lowest threshold. Katie was moving before the sound finished, her feet already eating the distance from the nurse's station to room 347, knowing what she'd find before the door swung open. The ICU at night had a particular silence, the ventilators and pumps creating a steady mechanical heartbeat underneath everything else, fluorescent lights humming their constant electric hymn. Then that scream. The general lay grey against white sheets, his neck veins distended like rope pulled taut, his chest heaving in that paradoxical way that meant the fluid wasn't outside the heart anymore. It was inside the pericardial sac, compressing, crushing, suffocating the organ with every beat. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis had been building for hours while the fever raged and nobody looked deep enough. Katie had seen it in Ramadi, the way trauma compressed the chest cavity, the way bodies sometimes filled with their own fluids when they couldn't drain anywhere else. She knew this pattern. Her hands already knew what came next. "Code Blue, room 347, she called, loud and clear, her voice cutting through the hospital's night rhythm like a blade. "Cardiac tamponade. I need crash cart and attending now." The charge nurse moved without question. Katie's tone had shifted into something harder, something that came from bone-deep certainty. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The resident on call appeared at the doorway, eyes still foggy with sleep, but Katie was already running an ultrasound probe across the general's chest, her fingers finding the landmarks, the fluid in the pericardium showing up dark as spilled oil surrounding the heart. The fluid compressed the right atrium, strangling it, suffocating the patient with every beat. 3 centimeters. Probably 4. Enough to kill in minutes. "Where's the surgeon?" she asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. The resident swallowed hard. "On call. 40 minutes out. He said he's not coming for a transfer patient." The words landed like cold water. A transfer patient. In 6 hours, the general was scheduled to move to a specialty hospital across town for cardiac intervention. In 6 hours, someone else's responsibility. In 6 hours, the general would be dead. Blood pressure now 58/40 and dropping. O2 saturation climbing because the heart couldn't pump anymore, couldn't deliver oxygen to the brain, the organs, anywhere that mattered. Time was not a resource. Time was a luxury they didn't have. Katie didn't waste breath on panic. She called the on-call surgeon directly, waiting through for rings of silence before a voice growled, "Make it quick." "Cardiac tamponade," she said. "Acute tamponade. Patient's crashing now. I need you here. I'm not driving in at 3 in the morning for a patient you're transferring. You have protocol, call the transfer team, get him stabilized, he moves when he moves." She didn't hear the surgeon hang up. She was already moving toward the door, but Dr. Caldwell was standing in the frame, pulling his white coat over cotton pajamas, his face bunched with the specific fury of a man who'd been yanked from sleep. He'd been home. He came because he had to. And he would resent her for it. "What's the diagnosis?" His voice was flat, stripped of everything except irritation. "Cardiac tamponade. Distended neck veins, paradoxical pulse, muffled heart sounds, hypertension. I have the ultrasound." She turned the machine toward him, showing the dark fluid compressing the heart. Simple. Clear. Obvious to anyone trained to see it. Caldwell looked at the screen for maybe 3 seconds. Then he looked at Katie with something that might have been contempt. "He's transferring in 6 hours. The surgeon said to stabilize. We do that, we document it, he moves. That's protocol." "He'll be dead in 20 minutes, Katie said." Her voice didn't rise. Didn't beg. Just stated the facts like they were unchangeable physics. "Cardiac output is falling. Every minute we wait, he deteriorates more. He needs an emergency pericardiocentesis now. It takes 15 minutes. You're a nurse." Caldwell's words were carved from ice. "You don't perform that procedure. You don't make that call. You certainly don't override surgeon directive. Go to pediatrics. Your shift assignment is being changed. Now. Sir. Now, Katie. Or I'm calling security right now to remove you from this floor." The hallway stretched in both directions, fluorescent and empty and cold. Katie stood outside room 347 for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to hear the monitor alarm still screaming its warning, long enough to hear her own breathing, long enough to feel the weight of every order she'd ever followed and every rule she'd been told never to break. The general's O2 sat was 62 now. Dropping. His blood pressure invisible. 45 minutes until the surgeon arrived. The general wouldn't last 45 seconds. She didn't go to pediatrics. She went to supply, moving with the systematic precision of someone executing a plan she'd memorized a lifetime ago. The 18-gauge spinal needle from trauma. The ultrasound machine would need to be brought here, but not yet, not until she had the field prepared. The guide wire and catheter from the central line kit. A sterile field from the general supplies. Normal saline to flush the line. A drainage bag from the dialysis cart 3 units down. Gloves, gown, mask, the ritualistic armor of procedure. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, like muscle memory was running the show and her consciousness had stepped aside to let the body do what the body remembered. In Ramadi, she hadn't called for authorization. She'd held a Marine's ribs apart with her own hands while her corpsman worked. She'd assembled field equipment in the dark while rounds came in hot. Rules were a luxury of peacetime. She set up the ultrasound on the bedside table, angling it so the screen faced her. The general's eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow, his body making those desperate gasping movements that meant oxygen deprivation was starting to affect his brain. She didn't look at his face. Not yet. Looking at faces made it personal, made it harder. "Hey." His voice was barely a whisper. "Hey, you were in Ramadi." She kept her hands moving, kept her attention on the supplies. "Need you to hold still for me. This is going to help. I know you." The fever-fogged eyes moved across her face, trying to track something just out of reach. There was a kid. Hudge. IED took his legs. You held him together until the bird landed. Katie's hands paused for half a second. Then she continued prepping, muscle memory taking over again. She'd been ordered to disappear. That meant no acknowledgements, no memories, no connections to that life. It meant becoming invisible. But invisibility didn't work when the person you'd saved was lying in front of you coding. The procedure. She kept her voice steady. Pericardiocentesis. I'm draining the fluid around your heart. It's compressing it. Without drainage, you die in minutes. With drainage, you live long enough for the surgeon to arrive. You understand? He couldn't really nod, but his eyes focused on her face with something like recognition. Trust. The kind of trust you only gave to someone who'd held your life in their hands before. Katie swabbed the chest with chlorhexidine, the sharp antiseptic smell cutting through the room's stale, recycled air. She took the ultrasound probe in her left hand, finding the needle insertion point at the fifth intercostal space, just lateral to the left sternal border. The pericardium showed up dark with fluid, massive accumulation, probably 800 milliliters or more, enough to strangle a heart twice the size of this one. She marked the spot with her fingernail, a tiny pressure that would be invisible to anyone not trained to see the signs of procedure. The 18-gauge needle went in slow, careful, at a 45-degree angle toward the shoulder blade. The general flinched but didn't cry out. Katie felt the needle slide through skin, through muscle fascia, through the visceral pericardium. Then it stopped. That particular resistance that meant she'd hit the fluid. One small movement and the needle would perforate the heart instead of draining it. One small mistake and she'd kill him. She held the needle steady, threaded the guide wire through the center. The wire moved through the opening with barely any resistance, coiling up inside the pericardial sac where it belonged. Then the catheter, sliding over the wire, taking the place of the needle. The needle withdrew. The catheter stayed. The first rush of fluid came, dark red blood mixed with serous fluid, the evidence of inflammation and trauma, pouring into the drainage bag like relief itself was dripping away. 60 milliliters. Then 100. Then 200, 300, the pressure releasing, the heart suddenly able to work again without the weight crushing it. The monitor's scream softened. The blood pressure crept up from invisible to 68/41. Oxygen saturation climbed from 62 toward 70. Not good. But not immediate death anymore. Not immediate death meant time. Time meant they'd won the next round. Katie stayed at the bedside for 4 hours. The drainage bag filled and refilled as the fluid kept coming, the general's own trauma, the sepsis she still couldn't identify, his body's violent response to whatever had damaged him in the first place. She changed the bag 3 times. She monitored the line, checked for clots, adjusted the drip rate, watched his vital signs creep toward something that resembled living. She didn't sit. She didn't rest. She stood at the bedside with her hands on the 4-pole, her eyes on the monitor, her presence the only thing keeping the night from taking him. At 5:33 a.m., the surgeon arrived, took one look at the drained pericardium, the general stabilized vitals, the emergency pericardiocentesis catheter running clean fluid, and nodded once in recognition of what had happened. What had been done? What should never have been done by a nurse without authorization? At 6:02 a.m., Dr. Caldwell walked into room 347 and stopped. His eyes moved from the general to the drainage bag to the catheter to Katie standing there in fresh gloves with 4 hours of vigilance written into every line of her posture. His face shifted through color she didn't have names for. What did you do? His voice was low, dangerous, the way the air gets before lightning. She didn't look away from the monitor. My job. You performed a procedure you're not certified to perform. On a patient you were reassigned from. Against explicit orders. Each word was carefully articulated, carved with intention. You just committed a professional violation that ends careers. You understand that? This is going to the board. I'm opening an investigation. You're done, Katie. Your career at Seattle General is finished. The morning light was starting to filter through the windows, the sun rising over Atlanta like nothing had changed, like a man hadn't just been brought back from the edge. Katie turned to look at Dr. Caldwell, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Seattle General, she let him see something other than acceptance. Not anger. Not defiance. Just absolute certainty, the way someone looked when they'd already accepted the cost and decided it was worth paying. "Then I'm done," she said quietly. "But he's alive." Caldwell's jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles cord at his temples. "Get out of this hospital. Now. Before I have security remove you." She'd known this would be the cost when she'd moved her hands from obedience to action. She'd known it the way soldiers always know that the choice to save someone might be the choice that costs you everything. She didn't move toward the door yet. Instead, she turned back to the general, checking the catheter one more time, adjusting the fall line, making sure everything would hold while she was gone. "You're going to be okay," she told him quietly. "The surgeon's here. You're stable. You're going to survive this." His hand moved, fingers reaching out to grip her wrist with surprising strength for someone who'd been coding minutes before. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Reaper." The name landed like a bullet she wasn't prepared for. Reaper 6. The call sign. The designation. The proof that he knew exactly who she was, and that the 3 years of invisibility had just been shattered by the man she'd saved. Katie didn't pull her hand away. She just looked at him, at the recognition in his eyes, and felt the last pieces of her hidden life slip loose from where she'd buried them. Then she turned and walked out of room 347, knowing that everything was about to change, and not knowing whether that meant salvation or annihilation. At 6:15 a.m., Dr. Caldwell found her cleaning up the general's room, the cardiac monitor displaying a stable sinus rhythm for the first time in 36 hours. His face went white, then red, the kind of rage that comes from watching control slip through your fingers like sand. "You're done," he said quietly, the tone more dangerous than any shout. "Security. Now." Katie didn't respond. She simply finished logging the procedure in the chart, her handwriting precise and steady, each letter formed with the same meticulous care she'd used to save a man's life. It was that composure, that absolute refusal to break, that made Caldwell's jaw clench so hard you could see the muscle working. He wanted her to tremble. He wanted submission. He got neither. Security arrived within 4 minutes. 2 of them, looking uncomfortable, because everyone in Seattle General knew Katie had saved the general's life while their chief of emergency medicine had ordered him abandoned. The lead guard, a woman named Chen with 20 years of hospital security experience, wouldn't meet Caldwell's eyes. "Ms. Morrison," she said quietly. "We need you to come with us." Katie nodded once, set down her pen, and followed them out. Caldwell was already on his phone before the elevator doors closed, his voice sharp and brittle as broken glass. By 7 a.m., he'd called 3 board members who owed him favors from a decade of political maneuvering, men who'd needed his silence about their own questionable decisions, who understood how institutional power worked as a system of debts and leverage. His voice in those calls was pure calculation. "We have a serious credentialing issue. No medical school verification. References are thin. I suspect fraudulent credentials. We need to protect the hospital." Not a word about his own failure. Not a word about the general's diagnosis he'd missed or the patient he'd ordered abandoned. Just the slow, methodical dismantling of someone whose competence had exposed his incompetence. By 8 a.m., investigators were already pulling Katie's sparse professional history, finding gaps designed to disappear. A VA clinic outside Fayetteville, no, the record showed it burned down in 2019, everything destroyed. Nursing school verification from a private program that no longer existed. References that checked out superficially but led nowhere deeper. Every credential authentic but every proof of authenticity carefully erased, because that's what you did when someone ordered you to vanish. The investigators moved like bloodhounds that had caught a scent, pulling at threads Katie couldn't afford to lose. What they didn't know was that Katie's military records had been scrubbed from every database by order of JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command. A Black Ops operation in Ramadi 3 years ago. That was the real word they needed to understand. Not Black Ops. Not vaguely. Ramadi. 2021, an operation so classified that even the Pentagon's classified archive showed nothing. A Marine general who'd had her name tattooed on his forearm because she'd carried him 300 meters through mortar fire while taking shrapnel in her back. She'd been ordered to disappear. To take a new name. To work in a hospital where nobody would ever recognize her. To become invisible. To become nobody. Now Caldwell's investigation was pulling at exactly those threads. They brought in outside investigators, retired FBI, the kind with private sector security clearances, men who specialized in credential fraud. They called the VA clinic. No record of Katie. Called the nursing school. No yearbook, no graduation records, no alumni listing. Called 3 character references and got phone numbers that didn't connect anymore. Not deleted. Just disconnected. By design. By necessity. By orders that came from so far above Caldwell's pay grade that he couldn't even comprehend the chains of command. The investigators documented everything. They called Seattle General's HR director. They requested her original application materials, her background check, her references. All of it careful, all of it legitimate, all of it designed to expose her as a fraud because she was, technically, exactly that. A person who didn't exist. A Master Chief Petty Officer who'd been scraped clean from every official record. A woman with a false name, false history, false credentials, ordered to carry that invisibility like a weight she'd never set down. Katie sat in her car in the parking garage at 2:33 p.m., engine dead, head pressed against the steering wheel. Her scrub still smelled like antiseptic and the general's room, like he was still there, still saved, still alive because of her hands. She'd worked the night shift. She'd stayed for hours past the end of her shift. She'd performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with supplies she'd assembled from 3 different carts. She'd drained 200 cubic centimeters of straw-colored pericardial fluid from a man's heart sac. She'd watched his oxygen saturation climb from 68 to 94. She'd brought him back from the edge of death. And now she was unemployed, under investigation, with a security escort still watching from 30 feet away to make sure she didn't take anything from the hospital parking structure. 30 feet below, she could still hear the ventilation system's low rumble, the sound of 1,000 hospital rooms, 1,000 machines monitoring 1,000 lives. She could smell the antiseptic oil that never completely washed from scrubs, no matter how many cycles through the hospital laundry. She could feel the weight of the investigation closing in like a collar tightening around her neck. In 3 years she'd built a life carefully enough that nobody could touch it. In 3 hours, Caldwell had threaded that needle and started pulling. Her hands wouldn't turn the key. They sat on the steering wheel, steady as always, no trembling, no shaking, no outward sign of the scream building in her chest like pressure behind a dam. Her hands had held blood and bone. Her hands had sutured mortar wounds while rounds were still incoming. Her hands had carried a Marine through darkness so complete that the only light came from incoming fire. Her hands had pushed down on a general's chest and brought him back to life at 4:02 a.m. while a man with a God complex tried to make sure he died. The rain started around 3 p.m., heavy enough to hammer the windshield like applause, like the room full of people she'd never see again. Katie sat there for 2 hours. She didn't cry. She didn't start the engine. She didn't drive away. She just sat there, breathing in the smell of stale coffee from this morning's thermos, watching the rain blur the hospital entrance from 5 stories down, feeling the last 3 years of invisibility collapse into a future she couldn't calculate. The investigation would find nothing, ultimately. Not because the credentials were real, they weren't. But because something bigger was about to happen. Something that would make Dr. Caldwell's investigation look like a child's question mark compared to what was coming. Something with federal implications. Something with a Marine general's name attached to it. Something that would bring people in uniforms to Seattle General's administrative offices with questions Caldwell couldn't answer and authority he couldn't challenge. But Katie didn't know that yet. She only knew that her hands wouldn't turn the key, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit alone in the dark with the weight of what you've done, not the things you regret, but the things you're proud of, and wait for the world to catch up. The parking lot was empty when Katie pushed through the ER doors that next morning, her final paycheck folded in her pocket like a dismissal letter written in numbers. 3 years of invisibility ending in direct deposit. The sky over Atlanta hung gray and low, the kind of morning that feels like punishment before the day even starts. She'd come back only because the paperwork required a signature, a formality, nothing more. The lobby was quieter than usual, a handful of visitors scattered across the waiting area, an elderly couple holding hands near the water fountain, a young soldier in dress blues sitting beside an older man in a wheelchair. Katie kept her eyes forward, moving toward the administrative office with the efficient steps of someone who belonged nowhere. That's when the hospital television caught her attention. The screen mounted above the reception desk was running a Dodd news segment, the kind that usually cycled through military stories between commercial breaks. But the image stopped her cold. A photograph of a woman in combat fatigues, face obscured by shadow and sand, carrying an A4 bag through a desert compound. The anchor's voice crackled through the hospital speakers. The Pentagon has officially declassified a story about a missing decorated combat medic whose service record was sealed for operational security. The medic, known only by the code name Reaper 6 during her deployment to Ramadi, saved 12 Marines during a complex ambush in 2019. Her identity and service record were erased from all official channels when the operation required her extraction and reassignment. Now, after 4 years, the threat level has been downgraded, and the Dodd is seeking public information about her whereabouts. If you recognize. Katie's hands went still. The lobby seemed to tilt slightly, the fluorescent light suddenly too bright, the hum of the ventilation system sounding like static in her ears. Reaper 6. A code name she'd buried so deep that hearing it spoken aloud felt like excavating her own grave. Master Chief. The voice came from her left, quiet and urgent. The young soldier in dress blues was standing now, his eyes locked on hers with the kind of recognition that belongs only to people who've stood in the same fire. Reaper 6? Katie didn't move. Her jaw tightened once, barely perceptible, but her hands remained steady. She turned to face him slowly, taking in the uniform, the insignia, the youth in his face that hadn't yet learned how to hide the weight of what he'd seen. He was Marine Corps, that much was obvious from the dress blues and the bearing that came from knowing what it meant to follow orders that cost lives. I'm sorry, I think you have me confused with, she started, but he shook his head, stepping closer. You don't have to say anything. My father's in that wheelchair. He's the general. He's been looking for you for 3 years. The soldier's voice cracked slightly. He has your name tattooed on his arm from Ramadi. He said if you ever showed up, I should tell you he still has the challenge coin you gave him. The ground didn't shake. The room didn't spin. Katie's composure held like a dam holding back an ocean, but inside something fractured open, a door she'd sealed so carefully that she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed. Before she could respond, before she could move, the elevator doors hissed open and the veteran security guard stepped out, the one who'd watched her work the ER for 3 years without asking questions. His face had changed. He was smiling, and there was something in his eyes that looked like recognition of a different kind. Master Chief Petty Officer, he said clearly, loudly enough that conversations in the lobby began to pause, that visitors turned their heads. Welcome home. The words hung in the air like a bell that had been rung after a very long silence. And then the general's wheelchair moved. He rolled himself forward from the waiting area with one powerful push, his recovering frame bent slightly forward, his eyes locked on hers with the intensity of someone who has been waiting for 3 years to say something he'd memorized 1,000 times. In his hands, he held a printed document, official, stamped, the kind of military paperwork that carries the weight of government authority. Katie's heart rate didn't spike. Her breathing didn't become shallow. But her hands curled slightly, and she crossed her arms across her chest, waiting. Katie, he said, his voice steady as concrete. I pulled every string I had. The DoD declassified your records. Look. He raised the service record high enough for her to see the header, classified, now declassified. Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Margaret Morrison. 6 years of operational service. 3 medals of valor. 2 Purple Hearts. 12 confirmed saves in hostile territory. The document was longer than her entire career at Seattle General, thicker with history than 3 years of invisibility could ever cover. And then he raised his forearm. Her name was tattooed there in military script, black ink and precision, Katie Morrison. Below it, a date. The date she'd carried him through mortar fire in Ramadi while shrapnel tore through her back, while blood soaked both their uniforms, while she whispered the same thing over and over, "Stay with me, General. Stay with me." The room went absolutely silent. Not the comfortable quiet of a hospital morning, this was the silence of people catching their breath, of witnessing something they didn't have words for, of standing in the presence of a truth that had been hidden so carefully that its revelation felt like a rupture in the everyday world. 10 full seconds of silence. Then 15. The fluorescent lights hummed above them like they were the only thing still moving. And then someone started clapping. It began with a young soldier, his hands coming together in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The elderly couple joined. A nurse at the reception desk stood up, and then another. The security guard was clapping too, and the hospital lobby, this ordinary, fluorescent-lit space where people came to die and heal and wait, became something sacred. The sound echoed off the tile walls like applause in a cathedral, building until it filled every corner of the space. Katie stood motionless in the center of it, her hands uncrossing, her composure not breaking but transforming into something different. Not fragility. Not relief. Just the simple, overwhelming reality of being seen. But that wasn't the end of Caldwell's reckoning. That afternoon, as Katie stood in the general's hospital room preparing him for his transfer to Walter Reed, her phone buzzed with a message from a board member she'd never met, Ms. Morrison. The external audit initiated by Dr. Caldwell's investigation has uncovered significant discrepancies in his departmental records. Patient charts with falsified vitals to inflate performance metrics. Treatment times that don't match security footage. Mortality rates systematically underreported. We're turning this over to the medical board. 3 sentences that would dismantle a career built on hierarchy and control. By evening, Caldwell's network had collapsed completely. The board members who'd owed him favors couldn't return his calls. The residents who'd laughed at his jokes about just a nurse suddenly avoided eye contact when he passed them in the corridors. The Liability Council had frozen his pension pending investigation. His license was suspended. The investigation he'd weaponized against Katie had triggered a deeper audit, and that audit had exposed the rot underneath: 6 years of record falsification, patient safety violations, systematic bullying of junior staff. The careful empire of control he'd built on humiliation and hierarchy came apart in 48 hours. 6 months later, a nurse who'd worked with Katie spotted him at a grocery store on the north side of Atlanta. He was standing behind a folding table in a parking lot, a stack of insurance pamphlets beside him, his white coat replaced with a cheap polo shirt bearing a company logo. No one stopped to talk to him. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. The man who'd built his identity on making people smaller was finally getting to experience what that felt like from the other side: invisibility, not the kind born from honor and duty, but the kind that comes from having nothing left to offer the world but regret. Katie stood in the general's room that evening as nurses prepared him for transfer, his hand pressed over hers, steady and warm and real. The tarnished challenge coin rested on his bedside table where it belonged, no longer something to hide but something to witness. She'd carried it for 3 years thinking it was a burden, a weight, a physical reminder of everything she'd been ordered to forget. Now it sat in the light where anyone could see it. "You gave this to me in Ramadi," he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. "Told me to hold on to it until you came back for it." "I didn't think I was allowed to come back," Katie said, and her voice was different now, lower, steadier, carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 3 years learning how to speak without being heard and was finally ready to be loud. The general smiled, and for a moment she could see him as he'd been in Ramadi, younger, heavier with the weight of command, standing in the dust with mortar fire echoing off concrete walls. "You never left. You just changed uniforms." 2 weeks later, Seattle General's board sent Katie a formal offer. Director of Emergency Medicine. 3-year contract. A salary that represented everything they'd tried to erase. A formal apology printed on embossed letterhead. Katie accepted it in a meeting where 3 board members apologized in person, where the hospital's CEO explained that the investigation into her credentials had been a grave error, where the word hero was used twice and she didn't correct them. That night, Katie walked through the ER in her new role, no longer invisible, no longer hiding. She greeted the nurses by name, the ones who'd worked the night shift with her, who'd known something was different about her even if they couldn't name what it was. She stopped at each bedside with the same quiet competence she'd always carried, but now without the weight of erasure pressing down on her shoulders like gravity. The young Marine she'd heard about during her last shift was waiting by the nurse's station, his father recovered and scheduled for discharge. He was in dress blues again, standing at attention. "Master Chief," he said softly. "Thank you. For everything. For my father. For all of them." Katie met his eyes and saw Ramadi reflected back at her, the faces of the Marines she'd saved, the one she'd lost, the invisible war she'd carried alone for 3 years in scrubs and silence. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said quietly, and the words were no longer a secret she carried. They were a truth she could finally speak. If you've made it this far, you've seen what happens when people are underestimated. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the quiet heroes who change everything, and let me know in the comments, have you ever been proven wrong about someone you thought you knew? Like and subscribe for more stories about the strength hidden in silence.